it's nice to speak to you today. I've been asked by my friends in Arabic to give a little bit of an update about the current situation from a geopolitical and strategic situation in Israel. And there's some interesting processes that have happened recently. There's somewhat of a contradictory situation right now. On one hand, Israel is quite strong, both economically and geopolitically or geostrategically, yet we're in quite a precarious and difficult situation, both in terms of internal security and in terms of internal politics, which relate to one another. Economically, I think Israel has had a very robust recovery from COVID. We're also doing quite well in terms of COVID numbers. The economy seems to have bounced back well. And over the last number of years, in particular, the high-tech industry and the number of startups that have had IPOs or been sold has been quite unbelievable. And the economy is definitely doing quite well. And this is also related to Israel's good geopolitical situation in the region. The Abraham Accords, which was the normalization accords that were signed initially with United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and were then expanded, have proven to be quite solid and quite beneficial for all partners. There's been increased tourism, increased economic activity, and just the fact that Israel, over the last number of years, seems to have more and more friends who are willing to publicly be our friends in the Middle East rather than just behind closed doors, has been a highly positive development. And there's been somewhat of a trickle effect as well to the Abraham Accords, perhaps the most significant being that Egypt, which has had peaceful relations with Israel for a number of decades since the Camp David Accords, has really upgraded relations with Israel. It was traditionally what's known as a cold peace, which didn't involve much economic or people-to-people or tourism activities. And recently, there's been much more of a warm peace. For example, Israel's prime minister met with the Egyptian President al-Sisi in Sharm el-Sheikh and received quite an honorable welcome. There are now direct flights, for example, from Tel Aviv to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is increasing tourism. And in general, Egypt seems much more comfortable being public about its peaceful relations with Israel. In addition, other countries, specifically Turkey, has really changed its approach to Israel. Not, I don't believe, because Erdogan has suddenly become a lover of the state of Israel, but because of very specific economic and geopolitical goals that Erdogan has. But for the first time in really a number of years, relations have warmed, and Turkey has really distanced itself for the first time in a long time from Hamas and from the Muslim Brotherhood in general. And even Qatar, which has traditionally been the supporter of Hamas in many approach. They are funding, to a large extent, various economic activities in Gaza, but they're also attempting to make sure that this money doesn't go to military goals, but to infrastructure and economic activities. So we have this very positive regional situation that Israel perhaps could have only dreamed of a number of years ago. But this doesn't mean that everything is wonderful in Israel. We have a very fragile internal security situation, which also relates to a very fragile political situation. Over the last month or two, there's been a spike in terrorist attacks within Israel. Some of them were actually, two of them were perpetrated by citizens of Israel, Arab citizens of Israel, while the more recent ones were perpetrated by Palestinians, mainly from the northern area of the West Bank, from the Jenin area. And these attacks have been somewhat different than attacks in the past, in the sense that they're thought of as lone wolf attacks, in the sense that there's not necessarily an organization that's organizing this attack, whether it's Islamic Jihad or Hamas, but it's people who take a decision and basically decide to go and murder Israelis, and knowing that they may die in the act or be taken prisoner. And they may, or they are likely incited through social media, but they're not necessarily part of any organization. And this can create a real intelligence problem for Israel, because Israel doesn't have the same tools to prevent such attacks as they would if we were speaking of perpetrators who are part of a terrorist organization. So a country that has the strongest military in the region and great cyber capabilities can't do that much to stop a terrorist who decides to take an axe, as was with the last attack, or a knife or a gun, and try to kill civilians, which is a very precarious and difficult situation. The last attack, in many ways, was incited publicly by the head of the military wing of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, through a speech he gave. And due to that, there's been a lot of public and media pressure to actually assassinate Sinwar. And it seems that right now this probably won't happen because, thankfully, because the military doesn't see much benefit for it, and it would very likely result in a new war with Hamas, which I don't think anyone wants. But there's really extreme pressure being put on the government to do something like this, maybe just for some kind of sense of vengeance, even if there isn't a real military or strategic advantage to doing something like this. Now, as I mentioned, I hope that the government is not pressured into doing this, but the government is in a very, very precarious situation politically. This government is a very odd and unique government in the sense that it has a range of parties from, let's say, the moderate right wing to the left wing, and also includes an Arab party, which is connected to the southern branch of the Islamic movement, which is in many ways a religious party, religious Muslim party. And the very idea that such a government would come to being is somewhat unfathomable, but it did come to being in a way as the only way to get rid of the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and to prevent another round of elections. But this current government could be on its last legs. About a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, one of the members of the Prime Minister's party, which is called the Yamina Party, the right-wing party, a woman named Idit Silman decided to quit the coalition. This is something that can exist in Israeli politics, where one person quits the members of Knesset who are part of it, which is exactly half of the Knesset, which means there's no majority. It's exactly 50%, 50%. And she decided to quit ostensibly. The reason she gave was somewhat ridiculous, because there was an idea that the Israeli court had made a decision that guards would not be able to check people's bags who were entering hospitals if they were going to bring bread into the hospital during the holiday of Passover. And for those who don't know, during Passover, according to Jewish tradition, we don't eat leavened bread, but we eat these flat bread called matzah. So this was basically an excuse, but she wanted to basically ensure some kind of a political future, because it seemed that the current party, Naftali Bennett's party, doesn't have much of a future. And I think she also, in a way, caved into very extreme political pressure being put on her by the people associated with the Likud party, with Netanyahu's party, or the further right parties. So currently, for the government to survive, it needs to basically do certain things to make sure there won't be other people who quit the coalition, like Idit Silman did. So, for example, the government has just passed a decision that it's going to build 4,000 housing units in the occupied territories. And this may not have much strategic logic to it, but it's, in my mind, quite clearly done in order to pacify other right-wing members of the government who need to show some kind of a goal being realized to their electorates. So this is a way to sort of maintain the coalition to the right end of the spectrum. But we also have a major problem where the Arab Party, what's called the United Arab List, is also tottering on perhaps leaving the coalition. They've talked about freezing their participation in government activities, which means they're not going to vote against the government, but they're not going to necessarily support legislation. And this is due to, in a way, the security tensions that have existed recently, specifically the perceived idea that Israel has created desecrations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Haram al-Sharif, the mosques on the Temple Mount. There have been various riots and protests, some violent on the Temple Mount, which have required Israeli security forces to enter the area. And there's also been the issue of Jews wanting to enter the Temple Mount to potentially to worship, which is against the current religious status quo. So the issue of the Temple Mount is a very sensitive issue, particularly for a religious Muslim party, that could end up resulting in the United Arab List leaving the government. So this government could last basically anywhere from one day, meaning like tomorrow. They could be an actual, by the time this is published, this could be old news. The government could actually fall. Or it could actually even last until another year. I don't think it could last much more than another year, because at that point they would need to pass a budget. And I don't see the current government getting the necessary 61 votes in order to pass a budget. So there's a very reasonable chance that sometime in the next year, we will be going to yet another round of elections, which illustrates that, again, despite Israel's very strong economic and geopolitical situation in the region, we have this very problematic issue of internal political stability and just inability to govern in a reasonable manner. I think I'll end with that. I hope this update was useful and interesting, and illustrated some of the challenges that Israel is facing and will likely continue to face, even if we do have another election, because the results will probably be somewhat similar as the last number of elections. Thank you for listening.